started. It was nice to see so many people here on a beautiful night. It's always hard to do programming in New York City because you've got to compete with all the other stuff that's happening in New York City. So when it's a beautiful night, it adds another degree of difficulty. But we have some great programming here, and we're really happy about tonight's conversation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eric Kleinenberg. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, which is where you're sitting right now. Also professor of sociology here at NYU. Because I'm a sociologist, I like to do little surveys and polls at the beginning of some of our events. I thought we'd just do a quick one here. Quick show of hands, how many of you feel highly satisfied with the media system that we have in the United States right now? Okay. Anyone concerned about media ownership as an issue? Yeah, it's certainly one of them. Well, you've come to the right place. We are here tonight to talk about a brand new book. We actually had trouble getting copies of this. It's burning through my hand. It's called How Media Ownership Matters. Rodney Benson, Matthias Hezris, Timothy Neff, and Julie Sadel are the co-authors. Rodney is here representing the group. Is that fair to say? You're representing the group today, not just speaking for yourself. And that's especially apt because Professor Benson is professor here in media culture and communication. It's really nice for me to be introducing him for this because you might not know this, but Rod and I were in graduate school together with the same advisor just a couple years ago, and both working on media. And I wandered off and did all kinds of different things depending on the day of the week, and Rod has stayed very steadily on this beat. And one of the things, I've got a whole bio for Rodney, but I'm just going to tell you that what's really distinctive about Rod is he's insisted on doing really rigorous, comparative, empirical, theoretically imaginative work to understand media systems in different parts of the planet. He doesn't just kind of rail about what's wrong with the United States. He wants to understand the U.S. system in the context of other international systems, and he wants to understand local media systems in the context of other local media systems within the United States. And he's really emerged as a great comparative media scholar. My generation, we're really lucky to have him at NYU, and I'm really excited about the conversation. None of that was in the bio that we so thoughtfully prepared for tonight. Rod, welcome to IPK. So the way it's going to work is Rod's going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, give you an overview of the book. Then we have two terrific discussants. The first is Anya Schiffrin, who's the director of the Technology, Media, and Communications specialization at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She teaches on global media, innovation, and human rights, and several books here. The most recent one she's edited is, I think, Women in the Digital World. Is that right? Anyway, Anya, it's really nice to have you. Okay. And then we have Steve Waldman, who is a former journalist who covered national politics for Newsweek, U.S. News and World Reports, and Washington Monthly. I first met Steve. He had one of the most interesting jobs in America. In the Obama presidency, his job was to travel around the country and understand what was happening in local media markets. Some people were concerned that we might have problems with local media. And Steve fixed all those problems. Well done, Steve. He's now, unfortunately, the problem is beyond his control. And so since then, he became the co-founder and president of Report for America, which is a national service program. And now he has founded and is president of Rebuild Local News, which is a project we're all engaged in. After the two of them make their comments, we'll open it up and have a big conversation. Then many of you might have noticed that this hot commodity is right outside on the table. We always say at IPK that all of our events are free and open to the public. All we ask you to do is not make the bookseller carry a giant box of books home. Nice, very simple ask. So I know that Rod is willing to stick around and sign a book. Is that fair?
I'm hoping to cover my summer vacation with that. Also, I would say that the books are discounted, so it's a better deal when you get anywhere else.
Okay, but anyway, help me welcome Rod Benson.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, we go way back, and Eric actually wrote a great book on ownership almost 2 decades ago. So I'm just trying to pick up from where he left off there. So, Michael Tonsowicz, Associate Director. Thank you so much for organizing this event. And Milin Oyazabal, that really kind of pulled this thing together. I want to thank Anya. I'd also mention your book on media capture, which is very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. And Steve Waldman has he's done all this stuff. He's actually done it in practice, what I'm talking about in theory, so it's great to have him here. Okay, so where do I start? Ownership is certainly in the news these days. These stories are just a few of many. Today, more than ever, it's hard to deny that ownership matters. But how does it matter? Most public discussions of ownership have tended to take two broad approaches. The first approach is moral and personal. When individual owners intervene in self-interested ways and undermine the autonomy of professional journalists, the natural reaction is to react with outrage, right? A powerful individual has exhibited a lack of character and integrity. But this criticism seldom changes the owner's actions. They do as they choose. In the meantime, we hope that someday someone will actually come along that will be better and that will replace them. Maybe the next billionaire will actually be benevolent. A second predominant approach to ownership is structural, but at a very macro level. This is the perennial and very well covered concern, very valid concern with market concentration. But this approach in and of itself also has its limits. In focusing only on the size of owners' holdings, it can shift attention away from the type or form of owner. For instance, the difference between a large market share controlled by, say, the BBC and a large market share controlled by Alden Capital. So in the rest of my talk, I want to explain what I mean by this third approach to ownership, what I call the sociology of ownership forms, and how we can put this approach to use at a moment of journalistic crisis. We find the beginnings of this approach in the work of the great British media sociologist James Curran. More than 30 years ago, he proposed an elegant model, both descriptive and prescriptive, of a media system composed of structurally distinct sectors. At the center, very British, public service TV like the BBC. And then surrounding it, spokes of civic, associational, professional, journalistic control, private enterprise, and social market media, which he defined as smaller private media partially supported by the state to promote competition and consumer choice. Curran, in turn, influenced the American media law and policy scholar C. Edward Baker, and some of you may know his work. In 1994, Baker had a sabbatical at Harvard University, and he used that time to closely read all of the U.S. research up to that time on ownership. And Baker forcefully concluded that this research had been too narrow. It had focused only on relatively minor differences between chain-owned and independent newspapers. And he asked why. Why, he exclaimed, why not analyze additional ownership forms? To really answer the question of how ownership matters, Baker felt research needed to explore whether worker ownership, for instance, or nonprofit foundation ownership, or public ownership, as well as various non-ownership mechanisms of control within privately owned media, would be more oriented toward democratic values. In a subsequent book, Baker added, an ideal media realm will be pluralist in the types of media entities that it supports. Policy should encourage their operation on the basis of different principles. These words of Baker's, different principles, have been ringing in my ears ever since I read this. Yet until now, other than scattered case studies, no one has really taken up this challenge of trying to systematically show how different principles translate into different performance. As a result, despite Baker's insistence that real differences in ownership matter, the reigning consensus in academia until very recently has been that the research has been, quote unquote, inconclusive. It's hard to believe right now. Or that it's just too complicated. That everything is local, that it's kind of random, there's good and bad performance under all forms of ownership. But are there no patterns? Is it really not the case that the most profit-driven owners are shaping journalism in fundamentally different ways than owners that are sheltered from commercial pressures? So I think the time has come to be more than anecdotal and to really try to answer this question. And just, in case you need to brush up on your geography, I've helpfully provided these National Geographic maps. So over the past decade, I've been leading a talented team of scholars, Matthias Hesseris from the Axel Johnson Foundation in Sweden, Tim Neff from Leicester University in the UK, and formerly here at NYU. At MCC, Julie Siddell from the University of Strasbourg in France. And we've conducted new research and reanalyzed old research to figure out literally if and how media ownership matters. So how this book is basically the fruit of this international collaborative research for over a decade. So why these three countries? The US, Sweden, and France represent the three types of media systems identified by Dan Hallin and Paolo Mancini in their classic book, Comparing Media Systems. And so our book is thus a modest step beyond the rampant US centrism of much media research. But to be clear, it's just a start for what I hope will be extended research to other parts of the world. Across the three countries, we conducted more than 100 in-depth interviews with news executives and editors. We gathered or created extensive original data sets of media outlet funding, audiences, and shareholders and boards of directors. If you're interested, it's the raw data. A lot of the raw data is it was much too much to put in the book, so it's an online appendix if you're interested. And we conducted large-scale systematic content analysis of news and opinion articles in more than 50 news outlets. But in order to conduct this empirical research, we also had to carefully construct our categories of analysis. What might be these different principles that Baker is referring to? Lack of clarity about these principles has held back research in the past. For example, many researchers refer to corporate ownership, picking up on the language of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. But corporations are not all the same. They can be stock market traded, with or without a dominant shareholder. They can be privately held, like Advance Publications, which owns the New Yorker, or Hearst. And these distinctions actually matter. Beyond this category of corporate, there are a multitude of specific legal forms, and this is just a small sample from our three-country study. You know, these differ, and so as soon as you start thinking about the forms of ownership, you're overwhelmed with the possibilities, right? How can we make sense of this complexity? So in previous papers, and in this book, I argued that the way forward is through the institutional logics theory, first developed by sociologists Roger Friedland and Robert Alford, and further developed by Patricia Thornton and other organizational scholars. Institutional logics is the theory of pluralism. It's a theory that insists that the social world consists of multiple, partially contradictory modes of understanding and acting in the world. It differs, say, from a totalizing theory of neoliberalism that insists that a singular logic shapes all human action, or even Bourdieu's binary opposition between an autonomous cultural pole and a heteronymous economic pole in the field of culture production. The institutional logics approach tries to understand how different ownership forms materially and symbolically embody different values and incentive structures add something new and different to the journalistic field. Bringing the institutional logic approach to media ownership, the book identifies 4 broad ownership forms, as well as several subforms linked to specific institutional logics or constellations of institutional logics. So these 4 ownership forms are market, private, civil society, and public. And some of these will seem very familiar to you once I start describing them. Market ownership refers to any owner primarily subject to a short-term profit maximizing logic, chiefly stock market traded, but also private equity and hedge fund ownership. Market ownership typically cuts its way to maximum profitability. As economic sociologist Neil Fligstein and his co-author Goldstein argue, layoff announcements are interpreted by stock market investors as a signal of shareholder-friendly management. When the number of workers declines, their salaries are added to corporate profits. And these kinds of cuts have to happen constantly. This is because the convention of quarterly reports creates a short-term focus that disincentivizes managers from taking any losses, even if those losses might make sense from a long-term perspective. There's anecdotal evidence of this and the effect on news content. For example, when BuzzFeed was privately held, they could invest in in-depth reporting, in-depth investigative reporting, even if it didn't attract a large audience. And we saw this on BuzzFeed News. I highly recommend Ben Smith's book Traffic if you want to read about that era and the changes that he saw. But as soon as BuzzFeed converted itself to a stock market trading company, it not only reduced the size of the newsroom, it also changed the types of stories that it published. toward more celebrity news, more breaking news, and eventually it shut down the news website entirely. Private equity and hedge funds can be just as, or as we know, just as or even more profit-driven than stock market trading companies. I talked to John Payton, who was formerly was the CEO of the Alden Capital-owned Digital First Media. And he told me, once hedge funds decide to start driving cash from the newspaper companies, they will cut the cost, take the cash back off the table, and start milking them for cash until there's nothing left. And we've seen the brutal effects of this kind of vulture capitalist approach to news at newspapers across the United States. Now, another market subform is dominant, is stock market traded ownership with a dominant shareholder. And this can be different. One example is the New York Times. And they've been able to kind of resist those profit pressures, and they've been able to take a long-term approach because they do have that dominant shareholder control over the board and over the voting shares. But to be clear, not all dominant shareholders are the same. Not all make the choice to defend and invest in quality, much less factual news. The second broad ownership form is private ownership. Private ownership is distinguished from market ownership in at least two major ways. First, it's usually a more concentrated form of ownership, residing either with an individual, a family, or a small group of investors. Second, although aspiring to generate positive revenue to support operations, private owners have no obligation to maximize shareholder value, and thus have greater discretion to balance profit targets and timelines with amenities of status, political influence, or civic duty. Private ownership is often linked to multi-generational family stewardship, but also, I would say it also incorporates employee ownership, as well as startups in which individual founders are given very long runways to achieve profitability, often a decade or more, with venture capital or angel investors. I would include this as part of private ownership. Private ownership can nevertheless be taken in very different directions. This is because media properties have what the economists call amenity potential. This means that even if a media property is not profitable, it can be useful in other ways. And those other ways can be political or policy influence, or cross-promotion of their other businesses. Understanding how this works helps us make the personal structural, right? So Bezos and Musk are able to do what they have done because they are private owners. Civil society refers to the associational and organizational sector between the market and the state, without being entirely independent of either. Civil society ownership thus encourages a range of distinct institutional logics: professional, primarily journalistic, but also academic, potentially, religion, and community, political party, labor union, national or local foundations. What unites these diverse institutional logics under the rubric of civil society is a strong mission-driven orientation and a certain distance from profit pressures. Finally, public media by definition have strong civic missions, but their ability to deliver on these missions varies depending on their level of funding and the extent of their arm's length legal and regulatory protections from state partisan interference. And I'll come back to these more at length. So now, these four ownership forms, market, private, civil society, and public, could be roughly interpreted as a continuum from the most commercial or profit-driven to the least commercial. And this continuum is expressed in, for some of you may immediately recognize Pierre Bourdieu here, that this continuum is expressed in Bourdieu's notion of the field as constructed as an opposition between the economic pole, which is more market-driven, and an autonomous pole that is less market-driven. And this certainly captures part of what's going on, but not everything. I say only part because the diversity of practices of ownership subforms, particularly within the civil society ownership form, I don't think can be totally chalked up to their less commercial character. There's more going on here. These practices are also shaped by the specific values and incentives associated with distinct institutional logics. So here are just a few examples of this something new and different, introduced by different subforms of ownership. Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science, church-owned Christian Science Monitor, committed the Monitor in the early 20th century to a different kind of practice of journalism. She used the words, "It would injure no man but bless all mankind." In other words, it was deeply contextualized journalism about social problems. It was very international, and it avoided any sensationalistic or partisan bias. In this way, she joined a particular religious logic to journalism to develop a new kind of journalism consistent with both journalistic and religious values. News outlets owned by political parties, that's not common here anymore, but it still happens in France and Sweden, or linked to foundations that are linked to party, social movements or trade unions. These kinds of outlets will link a partisan commitment, and their particular partisan commitment, to an informational or pluralist conception of public service news. And we, as I said, we see these concretely in different kinds of newspapers in Sweden and France. And finally, in the case of U.S. foundation-funded nonprofits, which you may be more familiar with, philanthropic funders concerned with policy or social change impact, and they often use the word impact, right, over maximizing audiences leads to a unique kind of news. It's less frequently updated, it's less exclusive, so it encourages collaboration and sharing across news outlets, which is very foreign to market media, or less common. And it's more exclusively focused on public affairs, investigative and in-depth reporting, and almost indifferent to the size of the audience. And I can capture this a little bit more colloquially with an interview I conducted with Chuck Lewis, who is one of the real pioneers in nonprofit journalism. And he told me, I was asking him about the audiences, and he had a hard time kind of articulating an answer to that. And he finally just said, I just want to investigate the bastards, whoever they are. And I want to do good stuff, and I want it to win awards, and I want funders to think it's cool and support it. So I think that is a particular approach that is very much facilitated by the institutional structure and the funding structure that they operate under. So to conclude, I will briefly highlight some of the ways that forms of ownership matter for the kind of news content that gets produced. In our content analysis, we measured 3 types of news performance, or what we call modes of power. First, public service orientation, involving the production of public service information and public service pluralism. Second, political instrumentalism, which we measure in terms of partisan attention, valence, and intensity. And third, economic instrumentalism, measures the amount of coverage that promotes the owner's business interest or suppresses negative news about those interests. As I mentioned, this content analysis examined more than 50 news outlets across the 3 countries. It's a sample that substantially overlaps with the Reuters Institute's designation of the largest audience media in each of those countries, but we also added a propositive sample that ensured that we had representation across all ownership forms. To contextualize our findings, we not only considered ownership forms, we also generated data, as I mentioned, for each outlet for audience demographics, education and income, and primary funding. In doing so, we sought to transcend previous debates about, is it owners, or is it funding, or is it the audience that shaped the news? And I think that's really a false debate, because of course, it's all of those. But we found that these, and we also found that these elements tended to cluster together, right? And these clusters we call ownership complexes. Ownership complexes are not just clusters of independent variables. Owners and their appointed managers actively develop these funding audience adjustment strategies. And so audience and funding power are not opposed to owner power, but are part and parcel of ownership power. That's what I'm trying to show how we understand that. So the first half of the book provides a thick description of these mechanisms, and we look at how does the political economy of media ownership translate into financial and editorial strategies. For this analysis, we drew heavily on in-depth interviews as well as other insider accounts and media industry sources. The final 3 empirical chapters of the book presents an original content analysis, provides some hard data about how these strategies translate into the actual news coverage. In order to control for cross-national differences, each outlet was only actually compared to other outlets in the same national field. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus just on public service orientation, because it would really have to be 3 talks if I talked about all 3 aspects, but maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. So what did we find? For public service orientation, we found that civil society ownership across the 3 countries is associated with the strongest public service orientation. This may not be surprising, given the praise that is often accorded famous nonprofits like ProPublica. However, a lot of the research to date on civil society outlets has involved small case study comparisons. So this book is really the first large-scale study to try to kind of study this systematically comparing it to other forms of ownership across 3 countries. To measure public service information, we analyzed, we used 4 relational indicators. We looked at what was the percentage of public affairs stories, what was the priority given to investigative reporting, internationally focused articles, and in-depth news topics. Civil society outlets, especially those owned by religious groups, provided the highest average level of public service information across the 3 countries and across these 4 indicators. And consistent with the logic of philanthropy funding, we found that investigative reporting in particular was highest at U.S. philanthropy-supported civil society nonprofits. We also measured public service pluralism in news content, which was measured as the using it's a standard. If you really want to know, I can tell you. But Herfindahl-Hirschman index is a great way to kind of measure the kind of dispersion of all the kind of types of actors and how evenly it's dispersed. So it kind of measures the concentration of certain voices versus the dispersion of certain voices. So that was a way of seeing, how widely do they bring in a range of voices and viewpoints. But once again, we found that civil society outlets had the highest civic performance. They were the most pluralist, especially political party affiliated outlets, right? And so I think that that's not just, that might seem surprising here, but partly that I think is also thinking of Julian Zelizer's book recently, talking about responsible partisanship. Part of, I think, what's going on in France, and especially Sweden, is responsible partisanship. So you have these partisan newspapers that are nevertheless very even-handed in kind of giving a range of views. Hallin and Mancini also distinguish between this kind of internal pluralism, the range of voices or viewpoints that each outlet represents, and the external pluralism of the journalistic field as a whole. So in this regard, a news organization adds to external pluralism by especially highlighting a voice that other media largely ignore. This table shows the outlets that stand out from their peers in the degree to which they highlight marginal actors, like social movements, smaller political parties, trade unions, etc. And here again, civil society outlets tend to be the outlets that most commonly perform this civic role. Now, public service orientation was also very high in public media overall. Second only to civil society ownership. And this is an article about Sweden's SVT, which is very similar to the BBC, but even more hard-hitting in a way in terms of its investigative reporting. So this is an article about one of their famous investigative reporting programs. But to be clear, some private or stock market traded outlets with elite audiences also exhibited very strong public service orientation, like New York Times, Le Monde, Svenska Dagbladet in Sweden. So to nuance the arguments that have sometimes been made about public media always being civically superior to commercial media, that's not exactly what we found, but we did find that public media's overall unique contribution was more limited, but still very important. So to help you decode this graph, recall that all outlets were compared only to outlets in the same national field. For every news content indicator, the raw score was converted to a 1 to 4 national relational scale, stretching from more than 0.5 standard deviation below the mean to 0.5 standard deviation above the national mean. Then the mean scores of all 51 outlets were combined to produce aggregate means for each ownership form. In this table, we only include those public media with mass omnibus audiences. So that's basically Swedish public media and French public media. So we use the term loosely to talk about public media in the US, but PBS and NPR are really kind of this hybrid between civil society and public media, and they serve very relatively small and elite audiences. So I didn't include them in this analysis. But this analysis, I think, really kind of showed what public media can do when they're large and strong public media. So here we compare these kinds of public media, public omnibus media reaching a broad audience, to other omnibus media. Commercial, all non-public omnibus media and non-public omnibus media that are legacy radio and TV. And here we see, I think, the main and very important contribution of strong public media is that they have quality and they have accessibility. They're reaching a broad audience. So, in conclusion, ownership does matter, and in particular, ownership forms matter. Civil society, and I'll make a few, and here I go maybe a bit, I speak only for myself, because I'm going into a kind of prescriptive register reflecting on these findings after the publication. So I'll just share some of my thoughts. Civil society outlets are often at the center of the book's findings. Is civil society ownership the best answer to the civic crisis of journalism? It's true, more than other ownership forms, civil society outlets prioritize public affairs information, and they give voice to political actors ignored by other media. So I think they are very important. However, civil society outlets, especially philanthropy-funded outlets, tend to be undercapitalized. And so even the revenues of the best-funded nonprofits, like ProPublica, so you see ProPublica there, barely registers, and that's the largest nonprofit that we have in the U.S. Unless maybe we count Christian Science Monitor, a few others, right? But the classic kind of philanthropy supported. So they are really outgunned, and undercounted. Finally, despite the lack of subscription paywalls on nonprofits and civil society, most civil society media, you can access them for free. Their audience, if you look at their audience demographics, they still tend to be very elite, right? I say tend because French and Swedish civil society outlets are not so small and not so big. So it doesn't have to be that way. In the context of market failure for all but a small handful of elite national commercial media, and of increased political pressure on public media, finding a way to scale up the civil society alternative seems more important than ever. But we shouldn't give up on public ownership. At their best, public media are absolutely crucial in providing trustworthy news for a large public. The key is to create an arm's length relationship between the state and public media and funding buffers that protect it from partisan pressure. Is there any civic justification for market ownership? Is there any use for all-in capital or Gannett? I was thinking about this. Can I come up with something good to say about it? Well, I mean, for one thing, yes. The thing that I can say about them is that given their scale, their scale I think is very important. They are still reaching a broad audience, and they still employ journalists, right? They still employ professional journalists who are trying to do good work under very difficult conditions. Media with market ownership still tend to reach larger, less elite audiences. And in the absence of especially in the US, in the absence of large-scale public broadcasting, market-owned media, for example, CBS, when its journalists are allowed to do their job, they provide some level of professional news for audiences who would otherwise rely, and even now are increasingly relying on social media influencers of widely varying quality and veracity. There are worse things, unfortunately, than market-driven journalism. There's market-driven quasi-information that has abandoned all pretenses to journalism and has no relation to journalism whatsoever. Private ownership is a mixed bag. It may seem that this is the ownership form where the individual owner does matter the most, but instead of just waiting around and hoping for the best, I think we should try to make it easier for those owners to give up their media properties. And to give it up to someone who actually, or some institution that will be more trustworthy. Presumably they would do this to get some tax benefits. It's not inconceivable. So this is what the former owner of The Guardian did when he established the Scott Trust. This is what happened at the Philadelphia Inquirer with the establishment of the eponymous Lenfest Institute. This had happened at the Salt Lake Tribune. It just recently happened at Le Monde, where the largest shareholder basically effectively donated his capital to an independently governed endowment fund that is now the largest shareholder of the newspaper and has an independence of government. If that's not possible, this is my last substantive comment. This is where C. Edwin Baker's comment about, and I just kind of mentioned that in passing, non-ownership mechanisms of control. What's that about? At Le Monde and other French newspapers, journalists have negotiated charters with the owner that clearly set out editorial standards and even vest in journalists, in some cases, the right of veto of the editor-in-chief. In Sweden, there's a legal institution of what they call the legally responsible publisher. And this is basically the editor-in-chief. And so if anybody gets sued, it's the journalist. And so that gives them leverage to push back against the owner when the owner is trying to get them to do something that they should not be doing. So in conclusion, if we care about ownership, And if we care about journalism and its contribution to democracy, I think we need to pay more attention to media ownership and specifically to forms of ownership. Media ownership matters. This book is an attempt to show how it matters, not to end the debate, but to keep the debate alive and to make sure we do something about it. So thank you for listening, and I will now cede the stage to our discussants. Thank you. I think we'll all set up here now. Yeah, my voice is bleeding out.
After years of teaching, I don't need a microphone. Okay, great. Well, first of all, I really want to congratulate Rod for this incredible book. I spent the week reading it, and it was so nice not to be reading the news about Colombia. So thank you for all that you've done. It's a huge contribution. It's really a tour de force. And to have this systematic study of 3 countries and not just, as you say, ownership, but also the effects it has on editorial, I think is so important. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, oh gosh, so that's how it works. It answered so many sort of lingering questions I've had over the years about different systems. I hope that for volume 2, you could do something that Steve and I would appreciate, which would be a dissection of all the government interventions and policies that are in place. That would really kind of give a beautiful bookend to this. So I thought it was all very important. Just now when you were talking, I mean, there's so many ideas, but I think in some ways you sort of confirmed what a lot of us had thought for a long time, that there really is a very important role to play for government-funded public service media, and also the role of nonprofits. And of course, your point that you just made now about converting from private to nonprofit is something that Steve has been pushing for years. That was actually how I got to know you, is your planting work. I thought was so exciting and interesting. So to have sort of real data on this. For me, one of the most formative papers was the Malenko Schiffrin work on the World Bank studies that came out about 25 years ago, and that sort of assumption that audience really matters. So this idea that ownership matters as much as, or something we have to look at as well as audience, I think is a really interesting point. So I thought that was fascinating. I also loved the point that you made about failure, because I did 2 of those more anecdotal studies. I did Publishing for Peanuts and then Fighting for Survival when I was on the board of Open Society's journalism program. And we interviewed about 40 small outlets in the Global South, including OSF grantees, to sort of see how they survived. And they were in your going bananas category. I thought it was so funny that our study was called Publishing for Peanuts, and you talk about going bananas. And what we really found was that 2 things that fit with what you're talking about. One is the outlets that found ways to make money ended up doing much less public service. So they found something that they could sell. I'm thinking of like Jornal Brazil that started selling legal news. And so what they did was great, and they're making lots of money, and they're a going concern, but they're not really doing the investigative public interest work. And then another point that we found as well was your point about failure. And that even when outlets went out of business, the people that ran them went on to do new things and sort of train the next generation. You had some people going off and becoming, PR people for the World Bank or the stock market in Hanoi or whatever. But mostly they went off, and I'm thinking of there's some of the Nigerian journalists who've had a bunch of failures over the years. But in the meantime, they have trained this incredible generation, and they sort of kept at it, but nothing lasted very long. And so I thought I really enjoyed all those bits about BuzzFeed and Christian Science Monitor and Slate and HuffPost and all these organizations that thought they found a new business model, and then actually they really hadn't. But they kind of managed to eke out a living for a while, so I thought that was quite interesting. I guess 2 things. One, maybe we'll talk about in the conference, there was a bit less on media capture than I expected. you were only looking at democratic systems. And so that's, or I was gonna say for some kind of America's democracy. But when I think of so much of that early literature on ownership, the idea is that completely government funded and government owned gives you a very sort of ideological media, and then a very competitive marketplace ends up reducing quality because of that catering to audience bias. So when I was thinking about your studies, they're all like Sweden and France, you know, pretty good shape, and something for the rest of us to kind of look at and emulate. And then I guess, of course, where we all end is a bit what you were coming to, which is what do we do now? We're obviously in a very terrible situation in this country. And yeah, it's not so much as Benton pointed out, and even a few years ago, it's not so much saving journalism and saving democracy. I actually don't believe that journalism can save democracy, although I know Jay's contributions in this area and the importance of public journalism are obviously significant, but I hope we can talk a little bit about what we do next, which I know is what Steve is spending all his time on, so thank you.
Thank you, Anya.
Sure.
I love that you brought up the failure part because I think we don't give enough. Some of these commercial failures, like BuzzFeed News, like Vice, you know, these are mixed legacies. I mean, they did some good work, they did some not so great work, but Vice News, Rue 89, it's a small startup in France that's gone now. You know, they lasted for a while. They did some great work. So I mean, something that lasted a decade, you know, even if it kind of collapsed at the end. And it's interesting. I think that's one of the, you know. So I'm not.
Can I come in here?
Go ahead.
When I did my book Local Muckraking, that was exactly what I found, was that the 19th century was so much like today, where you had these sort of one-man bands, and they would often hammer on one cause for 10 years, and then go out of business, like E.D. Morel and King Leopold, but they had a big impact while they were
Exactly.
going. So we were small, we had to create these huge institutions, but it turns out we don't.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's been one of the good things about venture capital. I think the venture capital has done some interesting things there and allowed some different things to emerge. Maybe that moment is ended as in the future. And you mentioned and the other impact is the journalists that take that experience and go on and do other things. The other thing is that it's been a little bit easier when things shut down for the journalists in France, because they'll get 2 years severance, and they live off their 2 years severance to start up a new outlet.
Now that's fascinating, because do you remember that, I think it was Matthew Powers, who compared Seattle to Toulouse,
And
right?
you talked about that, yeah.
And how Seattle ended up with more startups, because the people that got laid off were older and they had more social capital, more contacts.
Yeah.
Whereas in France, they would just lay off the young people.
Well, there's people from France here, they can weigh in at some point over there. There's also, I think, in France, like regions versus Paris is a big difference.
Oh, good point, yeah.
So anyway, that I just wanted to respond to that.
Well, first, just to echo what Anya said about the importance of the book, and it is really so valuable. We have a very specific instance of why the importance of getting more sophisticated about the term corporate media is a very welcome development. We were working on some public policy efforts to create subsidies for hiring journalists in New York State. And some of the folks who were involved in this said we should exclude or limit how much money should go to corporate media. And the definitions that they came up with were publicly traded. That doesn't really get at it, so we went back to say, like, well, what about, hedge fund owned or privately hedge fund owned? Well, okay, that gets some of it, but what about, publicly traded but privately controlled, as you have as a category, like, so the whole effort to try to exclude it from, media we didn't like, kind of broke down because of a lack of, a sophisticated typology for what that even meant, what we were really trying to get at there. So I think that this, were a couple of other things that struck me about this. It's a little depressing if I read this right, that the civil society-owned publications have both the most public service and the most elite audiences. We should really pause on that. That's pretty depressing. And I think that there is a danger of the new breed of nonprofit news organizations falling into some of the same traps and pitfalls that public media in the United States has fallen into. And it was very interesting to me that it's different in Sweden and France. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was why? Like why has public media in Sweden and France been able to expand its audience beyond the elite in a way that public and maybe even nonprofit media in the U.S. has not? I would also make you made this point at the end that public media in the United States is really a hybrid. It's not actually public media in the way that it is in other countries. You know, National Public Radio gets a relatively small percentage of its money from the government. It's a lot of donations, just as ProPublica does. And for that measure, you know, Wall Street Journal gets tons of money from the federal government in the form of legal notices and things like that. So I think one way that I've been trying to think about the question of public policy or public support, let's say taxpayer support, in elegant way of saying this, is looking at it that way. You know, you have, if you added, no one's ever done this, but if you added up the amount of the implicit subsidy of what the U.S. Treasury provides to nonprofit news organizations through the existence of the charitable deduction, it's probably more than the entire budget of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So that's a big public subsidy. Now it's going to all nonprofits, not just media nonprofits, but it's a significant thing. And we're trying to get people to sort of, rather than thinking of things as public or commercial, as first of all buying into the general concept that we focus on local news, that local news is a public good, and that it should have taxpayer support. And we're trying to socialize people with the idea that that can mean a lot of different things and a wider variety of policy options than we have traditionally had on our table. So traditionally, when you're thinking about public support in the public media in the U.S., the model was the government sets up an entity, appropriates money, and they give grants. And we think there are other ways of doing it. Like, so if you have if you have a refundable tax credit to a news organization for the hiring of journalists, that's a tax credit, not, you know, we wouldn't think of a tax credit as being public media, but in fact it would probably pump more money into media than all of the grant making. So then it becomes a matter of like, well, if you do that, what are the values you want to try to insert into policies like that? But I think it's a time where we really need to be thinking very creatively about what we mean by public media. Not only because, you know, it's been so, the brand has been so messed up by, you know, false claims and things like that, that having a traditional approach to public media is going to be tough anyway. In terms of the corporate ownership, one thing that struck me is that when I first started out a long time ago as a journalist, there was this sense that actually there were some advantages to being part of a big corporate media entity. You know, it actually felt safer. It felt more insulated from pressures in some ways. Big, institutional, bureaucratic, lots of money. You felt like, you know, you couldn't get expense cap.
Remember that?
You couldn't get pushed around by, you know, the government, you know, wouldn't push around big corporate media because corporate media was so powerful. And now you have this situation where big corporate media is more vulnerable because of the multifaceted natures of their business operations. So Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post is not vulnerable because of what Trump can do to the Washington Post. It's vulnerable because of what Trump can do to SpaceX, right? And CBS is not vulnerable primarily because of what they can do to CBS News. It's vulnerable because Sherry Redstone wants to get her merger approved, her entertainment-based merger, right? So being a multifaceted conglomerate now leads you to more vulnerability, not less, when you have a president like Trump who's willing to go at all those points of vulnerability. So I don't know whether that we need like a new typology. I mean, it is interesting to me that the New York Times has held up better than others, and part of it I think is the private ownership, but I think part of it is that's their only business.
Right.
Whereas the Washington Post, that's not their only business. SpaceX is also their business, and Amazon is their business, and so it leads to a level of vulnerability on other parts of it. I was interested also in the details about nonprofit media, and the one part of it that I felt like I wanted a little more, I wanted to sort of have more study done is we think in terms of market pressures being a thing that is in commercial entities. And having worked now at both, I felt like the market pressures in nonprofits were almost worse. But of a different sort. It wasn't like market pressures to cover a certain topic or a certain slant. But the anxiety about earning enough revenue is just as powerful in a nonprofit as it is important. Revenue is coming from somewhere else, it's coming from foundations or donors, and I think the nature of that anxiety is different depending on whether you're dependent on a few big foundations versus a lot of small donors. But the feel and to some degree the behavior internally of a nonprofit that is based on a churn of small donations is not that different from the feel of a newspaper that's worried about subscriptions going up or down, reader revenues. So, and I think part of that has to do with something we haven't talked about, which is the context for all of this stuff, at least in the local news space, is very different than 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, we were talking about all these different ownership types in a fundamentally profitable industry. And now we're talking about all these different ownership types in a fundamentally unprofitable industry, where the commercial models are broken and the nonprofit models are struggling for lack of sufficient funding. And I think that introduces like new cross pressures in how these folks behave. I don't mean to sound so negative about the nonprofits. I say that from the place of love. I mean, that's what I've been doing for the last 7 or 8 years as nonprofit-oriented journalism, so I'm a big believer in it. But there's enough yellow flags there about how that's going to work. And then the last thing I would say is about replanting. You mentioned that, so replanting is the term that we at our organization, which is called Rebuild Local News, uses to refer to policies either by foundations or government that encourages the transition of a chain-owned newspaper, usually, into a local ownership, or local ownership or control. So it might mean, it's really interesting examples right now. Newspaper in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this is a private, it wasn't part of a chain, it was a privately owned newspaper. It was donated to the public radio station, and then the local community foundation put in money to help make it succeed. So there's things like that that are happening that are shape-shifting the different structures. And I do think that that's an area where we should be looking to encourage it. Because partially, I love my nonprofit local newsrooms. There's 400 of them. There's 7,000 newspapers. And we cannot get to a healthy local news system just with nonprofit startups. We have to figure out ways of getting some of those 7,000 newspapers to better serve their communities, either through their current business models or conversions. We We have to figure out ways of getting public media to better serve a broader audience. We have to figure out ways of getting the new nonprofit sector media to not only do good journalism, as they really are, but do it in a way that is reaching a lot of people, which it's currently not. Really. So, those are my general thoughts. I mean, I had a lot of questions for you, but I think the one that jumped out to me most was this difference in the behavior of public media and I guess maybe also the civil society in Sweden and France versus the US. And why is it that the public media in the US is more elite oriented and less likely to be kind of omnibus and accessible?
Thanks, Steve. I'll be mulling these over. Great questions. The first thing about U.S. public media is that, it's about the history, right? So all the countries in Western Europe started out with public media. That was like the model. And that was the only thing. I mean, in France, they didn't get commercial TV until 1987, right? So they always just had big public broadcasters. And it's kind of the past dependency of legitimacy for this is just normal to have something like the BBC. And we never had that. We started out, what was normal was the commercial networks, which had public service responsibilities until we got rid of the fairness doctrine and various other things changed in the 80s and 90s. So public media here was an add-on in this late 60s and early 70s to a very commercial system.
Right.
And it was always underfunded, and so they were forced to go to foundations because they never got the public funding they wanted or needed. So you can't blame them for evolving the way they did, and so when they talk about viewers like you, they're talking about viewers that give us money, right? And
Viewers like us.
And so it's the incentive structure that gets built up over time, and it's too bad because it's hard to change course this late in the game. So I don't, where is that going to change? I don't know. I think that maybe building up from the local level, as you're working on, is one way. Build a legitimacy there, and people, it seems less partisan, seems less loaded in that way. Tax credits, as you say, I think there's going to have to be an American path to that. It's not going to be.
Right.
We're not going to get there. And why can't foundations themselves make accessibility a priority? Why can't they worry more about that? Say, hey, we're producing this great work. And then we also have to think about who it's reaching. And that they should care more about the audience. So I don't know, it's hard because it's, you could say the same thing about academics. What is the incentive structure in the universities to share our research with the broader world? I mean, IPK is maybe an institution that tries to do that on a small scale, but the incentive is to write for our fellow experts in a pretty non-accessible way, right? So I think a lot of journalists think I'm not going to get ahead by writing, in a more populist style. I'm going to get ahead by writing in a way that gets me a Pulitzer and appeals to my peers.
But also,
Which is not to say a Pulitzer might not be accessible.
But also, if you want an impact, sometimes it is easier or more effective to just go with the government.
The policymakers and it's and one person at ProPublic I talked to, it said we don't reach a lot of people, but we reach the right people.
Exactly.
But that's not just an elitist thing. That's an impact thing. We want to reach the people that can change. We identify the social problem. We want to reach the people that can do something about it. So it's a huge problem. I think that we've got we've got a bifurcated system where we provide quality. So this is where I disagree with a total, anti-commercial critique. We have really good commercial media that is targeted for elite audiences, and whether it's through subscription models or mostly, and that's what it's on. So you can't say that the market doesn't produce quality. It does. What it doesn't produce is quality for a broad audience, unless it does. And so in France and Sweden, they've got a tradition. It's challenged, but never in the fundamental way we see it here. They have a very large public broadcasting sector, and then they also have public subsidies for newspapers. So some newspapers French newspapers might get 30% of their revenues from press subsidies. And the whole, as a system as a whole, I think it's about 12 to 15% in France. It's actually a little smaller, it's like 2 to 5% in Sweden. But again, some of the newspapers that I talked about that are really kind of adding, the trade union papers or whatever, some of those are they're only staying alive partly because of the subsidies. So that's a hard sell here, right? But we've got to think creatively about it.
Well, there's, one of the things that surprised me as I've gotten to know the public policy piece of it is I'll talk to newspaper publishers in small markets, and they'll have a kind of instinctive revulsion about the idea of government funding. And then I'll say, so we should get rid of public notices, right? And they'll say, no, we'll go out of business if we get rid of public notices. In a lot of communities, I think in smaller communities, it's probably 30% of their revenue comes from public notices, which is a form of government spending. So in small markets, we're already there. So the idea that we've never done, we don't do that here in America, public funding of the media, it's out there, we just deny it. And that's not even getting into the historical stuff, which I love, which you all know about the postal subsidy. My favorite thing about postal, by the way, in case you don't know what we're talking about, is that one of the first programs that the first Congress did was to pass a massive subsidy for the newspaper industry. It was like its first big social program. And it was in the form of, and it worked. It really helped to sustain and enlarge the newspaper industry. When Tocqueville came along and said, wow, there's so many newspapers. He didn't really talk about that part of it, but that was part of why there was so much of a flourishing of the media. And, but to me, I actually, when we're looking at how to do policy, I actually go back to that and say, okay, it's all different, the mechanics of what you do, but what are the principles that made it work? Politically, as well as and I think part of it is that it was a simple thing where they said, there wasn't a body of Madison and Patrick Henry and others sitting around making grand decisions. It was a simple formula that was based on the distance that the horses were going to travel with newspapers. And so these scurrilous Federalist rags got subsidies, and so did these scurrilous Jeffersonian rags got subsidies. And Jefferson and Hamilton no doubt hated the fact that the opponent newspapers got subsidies, but theirs also got newspaper subsidies, and it was fair. And it was the truth is if you're thinking of in terms of dollars going to quality, it was horribly inefficient.
Yes.
Tons of money was going to crap. But in a way, the universality of it was what made it work.
Yes. I know we need to finish the questions, right? But I would just say that the French program in particular, I know, is a universal program. I mean, some newspapers get more than others on behalf of press pluralism. So some of the more vulnerable newspapers get more, but everybody gets some. So even the largest, the most successful newspapers, and in terms of the raw, that's not a percentage of the revenues, but in terms of the raw amount they get a lot. And so I think you've got to accept that. If you want it to really happen, you've got to pay some people that you may not want to pay. And so in this country, maybe you've got to say, hey, News Corp is going to get a little.
Yeah, well, that was our whole thing with the marketing codes.
Yeah, that comes up a lot.
I have more to say, but
Yeah, so we have about 20 minutes left. In order to squeeze in most of the questions in the room, let's take two at a time. So does anyone want to ask the question?
I'm just an average person. I'm not part of the university, I'm not an academic. I did work as a teacher for many, many, many years in public education. I, as a reader, am interested in impartial news reporting and honest facts, accurate facts. Therefore, I know when I read, I know what I'm going to get in the Wall Street Journal, and I know what I'm going to get in the New York Times, because they're both, in their own ways, slanted. So I think that and I think the public for the most part is interested in impartial, factual information. And he made a statement, we may not reach all the people, but we reach the important people. Well, each of those papers reaches the audience that it wants. It knows that audience. They are different audiences. So that really is depressing to me, because it means that you're always going to have this type of, I call it factionalism. So maybe the answer is that every newspaper has to have reporters on it who present divergent views. So maybe when they get together to publish the information, it's a combination of the two things that really cares about giving accurate, impartial information to all of the readers, what I think you think of as civil society. And that'll never happen.
Well,
I don't think that'll happen.
yeah,
But you understand the problem.
So that's the
Yeah.
presence of divergent views in publications. We can take one more
Thank you.
question. Anyone? Jay,
I really loved your summary of your book. Part of is the term logics, plural, the way you use that. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit for us on how that works, like how you identify a logic, and how you know it when you see it, and what analytical gain is there for speaking of logics of journalism or I just would love to hear a little bit more on it, and I have one suggestion for you in the same way, which is it would be really interesting, maybe not a book, but at least a good article to trace for us the logics of really shitty journalism, the logics of journalism that injures, just bad journalism like we sometimes see in Murdoch's. I think professional journalists would tend to say, we know about that most familiar thing in the world, nothing could be more predictable than bad journalism, but I disagree with that. It would be really interesting to find out what are the major ways that journalists go wrong and publishers go. So anyway, that's my suggestion, but I hope you could say a little bit more about this term, logics, which really helps, because if journalism has logics, then we don't have to argue just over which one is right. It's a tool of pluralism.
yes.
So the logic of shitty journalism and presence of diverse views within the newsroom. Comments?
I'll try, and that's one of the, first, that was one of the complaints about what Jeff Bezos did to the Washington Post. He said, oh, we're only going to have one point of view on our editorial page now. And that was a real break from the idea that we should have these divergent views.
And I think your point about public service media is that it did try to be media for everybody, right? So doesn't Swedish public radio have the highest trust rating of anything in the country?
Absolutely,
That the
and it's still the highest
BBCs
one.
of this world, sorry.
Yeah.
And so the public media does actually transcend that problem of
Tries to,
partisanship
yeah.
and tries to reach a broader audience. And that it's, I think you're saying we should have had that here.
So we looked at the political partisan preferences and audiences, and for French and Swedish public media, it tended to be pretty close to the center, the balance between left and right. Everyone was still watching it. So in terms of logics, it comes out of this sociological literature on logics, and there's also Boltanski's argument, and it's kind of funny almost. Boltanski, in a way, it's kind of started out pretty inductively. So your idea, let's look at all the really bad journalism and look at what kind of logics can we find. But so people come up with these lists. So I think Friedland and Alfred came up with 6 or 7, and Boltanski and Teveno came up with their list, and it's kind of almost comical, and you think, oh, is that everything? But it's better than a theory that says everything comes down to the market, right? So it's this idea that there's we live in a world, there's different value spheres, you know, and you could say within the religious value sphere, there's different religions, you know, but still it's like a religious worldview is a different worldview than saying at the end of the day, business is business, right? So in terms of like thinking about these, how that matches onto ownership, you know, several ways in terms of from the interviews, how are they kind of justifying what they do, how do they think of what they do, looking at the mission statements of the, so that's in the book, you know, and we can kind of see that these different publications have different mission statements, like, or like on the about page, when they say, hey, what are we about? They would use kind of different kinds of language. And so it's kind of trying to look at all that together and say, can we see a pattern here? And so any particular outlet, these are analytical categories, any particular outlet is not going to have just one logic. Right. So, but then we can still see that some logics are more prevalent in some outlets than others, and we can see how they cluster together. So I don't think this is the definitive categorization, but I think it's useful. To me, it was useful to go beyond the just market-driven or not market-driven. That there's more going on than that.
I'm hearing like the development of a kind of a new logic that's coming up in the nonprofit space, which is in the early days of the nonprofit news, digital news system. It really was a lot about investigative reporting and accountability. And the foundations put their thumb on the scale for that and said that's what they wanted. There was a logic to it, like, you know, the systems fall apart, let's deal with the stuff that's most. But there's much more interest now in a separate social function, which is community cohesion. The idea that, oh, there was this other function that local news played, not just accountability function, but the functions of community cohesion, for lack of a better word. It's people knowing each other, people understanding their community, people understanding their government. And sometimes it's not investigative. That might be obituaries, high school sports, and stories about inspiring people and small businesses and things like that. I'm excited by this because I think it might also help solve the riddle or the problem that the nonprofits have had, which is they do great journalism, but not very many people read them. And so this notion that there's but they had previously, I shouldn't say they, because I was part of the problem, of like we tended to view things like that as soft, you know, and not valuable. Now that we see society fly apart and fragmented and polarization being a big, big problem, we say, oh, it turns out those things that we thought were soft actually had an important social function. And that gives you an argument to go to foundations and say, you should give us money not only for investigative, but for the full range of content that can bring readers.
So as someone who spent early years covering school boards in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I think that there's so much fantasy about the role of local news. And even in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there was antagonism, polarization. The sports stories were a way of kind of promoting the football team while they were cutting the arts budget. So I learned a lot during those 2 years, and the polarization too, because we already had, you know, the taxpayers people running on the taxpayers' ticket, and then actually turning out to want to dismantle, you know, drug education, anti-Semites, and when, you know, Bethlehem was a steel town, and when the teachers went on strike, everybody turned against them, and this was in the 80s, so I think local news is a bit of a snake pit myself, but I don't know, maybe it could be better. One thing though I did think that you said that was super interesting, sorry, was I just got back from the International Journalism Festival in Perugia, and I felt like there was, I thought everybody would just be so upset about losing funding, which they were, but there was also a bit of a come to Jesus moment, and I feel like people are slightly turning on the nonprofits now, and sort of saying, I don't know, kind of, or the intermediaries, like, you know, you had all these years and you never got it together, we didn't find a business model, and we have to really look at ourselves and what should we have done differently. And of course, you know, I come from 2 generations of book publishers, so I never believed you could make money doing the good stuff, really. And I'm with you. You know, if you want the good stuff, you just have to pay for it and not flagellate all the, you know, some digital native from Cameroon for not figuring out the business model. That was like a lie told to everybody by Google and Facebook. Remember all that? Oh, there's going to be so much advertising online. It's going to be fantastic. You know, that was just, anyway, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned briefly these public service broadcasters and how they're considered highly trustworthy. But I was just wondering, there was a bullet point mentioning that they could be vulnerable to whoever's in power by the state if they were actually in any threat by any of the elections, any of the parties that would have been in power. Because as a Canadian, the Conservative Party was used to defund the CBC. And to basically treat it as just like any other news broadcaster in a for-profit business, which would have, it would have removed that entirely. So I was wondering if, you see that in either branches.
I think my question ties on really well to this one, which is I was wondering if you could talk more about the role of the state in these different, because you talk about media ownership matters, of course, but I was wondering, like, in the different case studies, I mean, yes, they're all kind of liberal democratic systems, but obviously different. And so, like, how do you think about the role of the state with respect to these different kinds of ownership models? Like, if you could elaborate on that.
Right. And so the first question was of threat from, I mean, yeah, in Sweden, I mean, we've seen it already with the Maloney government. What's that?
England, where they've tried to defund it.
Yeah, so it's happening, and basically there's a kind of right, populist right, far right, or whatever, that is not playing by the same rules as the conservatives previously in Western Europe. So to the extent that they come into power, then things can really change, and so that's what everyone says. The other thing that really has made it a little harder for public broadcasters is that they had a dedicated license fee that kind of sort of separated from taxes. Everyone's just kind of used to that, and so it's like you bought your TV, and then you would get a bill after that once a year. And everyone knew this is a dedicated fee because I have a TV. Well, now people don't buy TVs, and so they've had to return funding to the general funding, even though they kind of try to separate a little bit. Everyone knows now it's part of my taxes, and then it becomes more vulnerable. So that's something that's kind of in place. I mean, the state. I think the state. The difference is, the broad difference is the state directly funds media in Sweden and France, and here it indirectly. The non-foundation, non-profit sector is.
I guess that's
Foundation is massive, because of the
in terms
tax
of your
system.
conceptualization, because you had, I really appreciated all of your different categories where it wasn't just like corporate, so you were actually doing, you were bringing more nuance into
Right.
that. So I was wondering then, like, in terms of articulating, right, with like how would you conceptualize like the role of the state within these different categories that you had, right? So
Right.
So like how do you kind of think about the state, like
Yeah,
conceptually
yeah.
with respect to media ownership?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that would be sort of getting into the whole history of these 3 countries, and I would just say that the U.S. has it's much more taboo for the state to be directly involved. I'm not sure how I can answer that beyond what we've discussed, but.
One thing that's interesting, Jay and I were at a conference in Canada recently, and there was somebody from Finland. And what's interesting is, and you know much more history than I do, but how often the state stepped in as a way of bringing back and bridging societies together after wars, right? So public media was viewed as a way of fighting polarization, which I think is really interesting. I had not known that
The
about
whole
Finland.
Oh, Germany as well.
Yeah,
That's the whole thing, is
Yep.
that.
BBC. So it was all sort of building back better, I guess we could say. The idea that public media could do that sort of gets us to what do we do now. I mean, I organize this conference every year called Saving Journalism. Anybody who wants is welcome to come. It's open to whoever is interested. And one of the things we try to do is bring together together policymakers and scholars and NGOs and journalists from all over the world. So we'll have someone from Indonesia on a panel with somebody from Australia or somebody from France, and all try to Korea, all try to learn from each other. And I guess I was wondering, in this terrible situation that we're in now, is there any lesson from France or Sweden that we can learn from? Is there anything they can learn from us? I know I shouldn't put you on the
Meaning the
spot.
attacks on press freedom, not the
Yeah. In a country that's polarized, that turns against, I mean, we know that when you attack journalism, people start to distrust it.
I
What-
think
what do we
people
do?
understand that their public service broadcasting is the crown jewel of their media system. There's a resistance, and for the most part, there's a substantial portion of the right that still agrees with that, and that's what's changed here.
Yeah.
Is there's a substantial part of the right in France and Sweden that still plays nice with the left, and that's broken down here.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, well, in Germany, there is that system kind of like the BBC, where people have to pay a fee, but it's very disputed, and there's a lot of anger against the public broadcasting stations. People, they're not accurate, they're lying to us, they're taking too much money, they don't have anything to show for, but it's not as easy peasy as showing it. I think they have the same discussion in Great Britain.
What's that?
They have the same debate in Great Britain, people who don't think it should be.
Yes, I mean, I think some of my European colleagues tell me that I idealize.
Yes.
I mean, they're having, it's not perfect, and there's challenges.
They always say that, and we're like, listen, it could be worse. Bashing the BBC already, and Switzerland also had a
Probably,
had a
yes.
referendum to dismantle their monarchy. A few years ago. Didn't pass, thank God. But, you know, they have those referendums actually.
I mean, so that's why, I mean, I'm a big fan of good public broadcasting, but in a way, at the end of this book, I feel like, maybe that's not gonna happen here, and so maybe we gotta get foundations to do a kind of different kind